The war had raged for over a decade. The Zalor Dominion, a militaristic empire spanning hundreds of star systems, had systematically crushed every opposing force in its path. Their fleet was vast, their technology advanced, and their strategy ruthless. The United Galactic Federation, a fragile coalition of species, had been forced into retreat time and time again. Each battle left the Federation weaker, their defenses shattered, their hope dwindling. It was only a matter of time before the Zeller would reach the Federation's core worlds and bring the final blow. Now, in the distant Yaros sector, the last major line of defense stood against the inevitable. The Federation had mustered what remained of its forces, a ragtag collection of battle-worn cruisers, outdated frigates, and a handful of surviving dreadnoughts. The Zalor forces outnumbered them 5-1. Their capital ships loomed in the darkness, their hulls bristling with weaponry capable of reducing planets to molten wastelands. The Zalor's Supreme Admiral, Vorak Thal, watched from the bridge of his flagship, the Dominance, a behemoth of destruction that had led countless conquests. Victory was assured. The Federation commanders knew it too. There would be no reinforcement fleet coming to save them, no last-minute miracle. And yet, as Vorak Thal prepared to deliver his final order, a new signal appeared on their long-range sensors. One ship. Alone. It was moving fast, faster than any warship should. Its course was direct, unwavering. Vorak Thal narrowed his glowing red eyes, his mandibles clicking in irritation. A lone vessel? A desperation move, perhaps? A diplomatic envoy begging for surrender? It didn't matter. One ship posed no threat to the Dominion. "Identify the vessel," Vorak commanded, his deep voice resonating through the bridge. His crew scrambled to comply, their talons moving swiftly over control panels. A moment later, an officer turned, his yellowed eyes betraying hesitation. "The vessel is human, Supreme Admiral." A murmur rippled through the bridge. Vorak's mandibles twitched slightly. Humans. The Federation had many member species, but humans had always been different, unpredictable, reckless, dangerous in ways that logic could not always explain. But a single warship? Against his fleet? It was laughable. "Transmit a warning," Vorak ordered. "Tell them to alter course or be destroyed." His communications officer hesitated. "Supreme Admiral, they are not responding to hails." That gave Vorak pause. He turned to the massive viewport before him, watching as the human warship approached. It was sleek, its dark hull devoid of insignia. Unlike Federation ships, which bristled with external weapon emplacements, this vessel was smooth, almost featureless. No visible weapons, no open communication channels, no signs of standard fleet coordination. It was unsettling. "Has it powered weapons?" he asked. "Negative, Supreme Admiral," his tactical officer replied. "No energy spikes, no shield modulation. It's not even attempting evasive maneuvers." A cold, unfamiliar sensation crawled into Vorak's mind. It wasn't fear. He was Zalor, and Zalor did not fear. But there was something deeply unnatural about this. A lone ship moving straight toward an overwhelming armada, making no attempt to defend itself or even acknowledge the situation. "What is its classification?" he demanded. The officer hesitated before answering. "Unknown, Supreme Admiral. No records match its hull signature. No known human vessel shares its dimensions. Unknown." That word sent another ripple of unease through the bridge. The Dominion's intelligence network was vast. They had records of every military ship, every warship class ever produced by the Federation, including human designs. And yet, this vessel did not exist in any database. Vorak's clawed fingers tightened around the command railing, prepare to destroy it. The order was met with immediate action. Dozens of Zalor warships adjusted their trajectories, locking on to the incoming target. Missiles primed, plasma batteries hummed to life, and ion cannons swiveled into position. The human warship was still moving steadily forward, showing no reaction. Then, just as the Dominion fleet was about to fire, it vanished. Gasps echoed through the bridge. Vorak's eyes widened slightly. The warship had been there 1 second, gone the next. No jump signature, no distortion, no energy surge. It simply ceased to exist on their sensors. "Find it," Vorak roared. "Where did it go?" His officers frantically recalibrated their instruments, scanning every spectrum, every possible reading. Nothing. No trace of the vessel remained. The entire fleet, a force capable of annihilating planets, was now grasping at shadows. And then, "Supreme Admiral," a voice cried out in alarm, "it's behind us!" Vorak spun around, his gaze snapping to the rear displays. There it was. The human warship had reappeared directly behind the Dominion formation, positioned perfectly to strike at their vulnerable engine arrays. But it wasn't attacking. It wasn't moving aggressively. It was simply watching. The Supreme Admiral felt his mandibles tighten. This was no accident, no mechanical malfunction, no fluke of technology. This warship had moved with intention. It had chosen this position. It had allowed itself to be seen and had just as easily disappeared. It was playing with them. "Target it!" Vorak barked, but even as his words left his mouth, the warship vanished again. The Dominion fleet fired into empty space. Plasma bolts and missiles streaked toward the last known position, detonating uselessly in the void. It was gone. "Impossible!" one of his officers whispered. Vorak turned toward his crew, his frustration bubbling beneath his rigid composure. "Activate all sensor sweeps. Maximum range. I want that ship found." His officers obeyed, their movements tense. But even as they worked, Vorak knew something none of them wanted to admit. This battle was no longer going according to plan. And for the first time in his long career, Vorak Thal had the creeping realization that he was not the hunter in this encounter. He was the prey. Vorak Thal stood motionless on the bridge of the Dominance, his claws gripping the railing with controlled force. His mind worked furiously to process what had just happened. The human warship had reappeared, sent a direct transmission to his command channel, and then, without firing a single visible shot, annihilated one of the Dominion's most formidable battlecruisers. The Devourer had been reduced to a drifting mass of debris, its structure crumbling inward as if something had crushed it from the inside. The Supreme Admiral had seen countless battles, had ordered the destruction of planets and entire civilizations, but never had he witnessed such an attack. One that left no trace, no pattern, no logical explanation. His officers remained frozen, their eyes flicking between sensor screens that showed nothing, and the viewport that revealed only the cold, lifeless wreckage of Devourer. The voice of the human had been calm, confident, and, worst of all, unbothered. It was not the arrogance of an inexperienced soldier, nor the desperation of a dying force. It was the voice of someone who knew exactly what was going to happen, and was merely watching the pieces fall into place. Vorak had never believed in superstition, but for the first time a thought crawled into his mind that he could not easily dismiss. Was he fighting something beyond his comprehension? He forced the thought down, shoving it into the depths of his mind where it would not interfere with his next command. "All ships, defensive formation, now!" His voice cut through the silence of the bridge like a blade. His officers reacted instinctively, their training overriding the growing unease that had settled in their chests. The Dominion fleet shifted, tightening its ranks into a layered defense. It was a formation designed for one purpose: to trap and eliminate a single target. Every ship coordinated its fire zones, overlapping to create an impenetrable wall of destruction. No vessel, no matter how fast or how advanced, could evade the sheer volume of firepower the Dominion could unleash. Alarms flared across the command consoles as the human warship moved again. It did not charge toward them, it did not attempt to evade. It simply drifted, slowly, as though it had all the time in the universe. Vorak's mandibles clenched. It was mocking them. "Fire!" The order was instantaneous. A storm of plasma bolts, railgun rounds, and high-velocity ion cannons erupted from the Dominion fleet. The battlefield became a blazing inferno of destruction, the energy from their collective barrage distorting space itself. Every weapon was locked onto the same coordinates, ensuring that even the fastest ship in the galaxy would be reduced to nothing but atoms. And yet, when the flames cleared, the human warship remained untouched. Not because it had dodged the attacks, not because it had activated shields of superior strength. No, the weapons had simply passed through it, as though it wasn't even there. The entire bridge of the Dominance fell into stunned silence. No one spoke. No one moved. The readings on their screens confirmed that the warship was still there, still real, still moving. But their weapons had not even acknowledged its existence. Then the voice returned, but this time it was different. Before the human had been amused, almost entertained. Now there was something new in its tone. Interest. "You're going to fire it, aren't you?" Vorak's eyes narrowed. "Charge the Omega Lance." The bridge remained still for a fraction of a second before his officers rushed to obey. The Omega Lance was not just a weapon, it was the weapon. A planet killer, a weapon so destructive that its mere activation sent ripples through local gravitational fields. It was the Dominion's ultimate trump card, a weapon meant to turn entire worlds into barren husks of rock and dust. If anything in this battle could destroy the human warship, it was this. The Dominant shuddered as massive power conduits redirected energy into the Omega Lance. Status screens flashed warnings of gravitational distortions, but Vorak ignored them. The human voice remained silent now, and for the first time, Vorak felt a shift. The confidence was still there, but the amusement was gone. The human wanted to see what would happen. "Omega Lance at 73% charge," his weapons officer reported. "Fire the moment it reaches 100. Vorak did not take his eyes off the viewport. The human ship was still there, unmoving. It did not attempt to flee. It did not engage. It was waiting. "You don't even know what it will do to me," the voice murmured. Vorak exhaled slowly, his mandibles tightening. "And you don't know what it will do to you." The bridge remained silent. The Omega Lance surged toward full charge. Then, without warning, the energy buildup stopped. Not because of a system failure. Not because of enemy interference. The Omega Lance simply ceased to function. The bridge officers frantically checked their controls. "Supreme Admiral," his weapons officer stammered. "The weapon is offline." Vorak's claws pressed into the metal railing. "What do you mean, offline?" "I mean it won't fire. Everything is intact, but the lance is gone." The words were absurd. The Omega Lance could not simply disappear. It was part of the ship. And yet, every readout confirmed it was no longer there, as though something had erased it from existence. The human voice returned, quieter this time, colder. "You need to understand, Admiral, this is not a battle, a long pause. This is a lesson." The human warship vanished once more, slipping back into the void like a shadow dissolving into darkness. Vorak Thal had never been afraid in his life. He had crushed rebellions, destroyed planets, led the Dominion to conquest after conquest. He had stood on the ashes of fallen civilizations and had never once doubted his own superiority. But as he stared into the empty space where the human warship had just been, he felt something he had never experienced before. Not just fear. Helplessness. Vorak Thal's mandibles clenched so tightly that he felt the pressure crack through his jaw. His bridge was silent, every officer frozen at their stations, their claws hovering over controls that now felt meaningless. The human warship had disappeared again, not through a jump, not through stealth, not through any known form of technology. It had simply ceased to exist in the way a flame vanishes when snuffed out. It left no energy trail, no signature, nothing. But Vorak knew it was still out there, waiting, watching. His breath came slow and measured as he turned to his officers. "Resume full-spectrum scans. Continuous sweeps. If it moves, If it so much as vibrates a particle of dust, I want to know." His tactical officer swallowed and began issuing commands, but the entire crew knew the truth. Sensors had been useless. If the human warship wanted to be seen, it would be seen. If it did not, the Dominion fleet might as well be blind. Vorak straightened. He could not afford to show weakness. Not in front of his crew. Not in front of the officers who had followed him across countless conquests. Fear was a disease, and it spread like wildfire in the vacuum of uncertainty. He needed control. "Admiral, incoming signal." A fleet-wide transmission. His communications officer hesitated before adding, "It's visual." Vorak exhaled slowly. "Display it." The viewport shimmered, and the image of the human warship filled the bridge. It was not a traditional transmission. There was no official insignia, no structured message. Instead, the image was raw, unfiltered. The warship was changing. Its form flickered, not like a failing projection, but as if it could not decide what it was. Its structure seemed to shift between different designs, as though 1,000 variations of itself were competing to exist at the same time. It was every shape and no shape at once. The longer Vorak looked, the more his mind rebelled against the image. His vision blurred, a deep nausea settling in his gut. He blinked hard, forcing his focus. Around him, several officers recoiled, clutching their heads, as if something had physically struck them. Then the voice returned. "You were trying so hard to understand." It was the same human, but now the tone was different. It was not mocking, not condescending. It was studying. Vorak forced himself to remain composed. "You have violated Dominion space, disrupted our fleet, and attacked without cause. Identify yourself properly or be destroyed." The voice chuckled, but there was no malice in it. Destroyed? By what? The warship's image flickered again, the outlines of its hull shifting through dozens of unrecognizable configurations before settling once more. "You assume I am like you, that I play by the same rules." Vorak inhaled through his nostrils, steadying himself. "If you are not here to fight, then what is this?" "A demonstration," the voice answered simply. A flicker of motion on the viewport caught Vorak's attention. The human warship had reappeared, but not where he expected. It was inside his fleet, not outside the formation, not closing in from the edges. It was there, among them, as though it had always been present. The ships nearest to it had not even adjusted their courses, their navigational systems still oblivious to its existence. The realization sent a chill through Vorak's spine. The warship had not moved into position. It had chosen to be noticed. "Admiral," a sudden cry from the weapons officer. "Multiple ships are reporting system failures, power fluctuations." "Sir, entire vessels are going offline." Vorak's eyes darted to the tactical display. His fleet, his vast and unstoppable armada, was fracturing. Whole destroyers were shutting down, their engines silencing, their defenses collapsing. Their crews were still alive, still sending panicked transmissions, but their ships had become lifeless husks. Nothing had touched them. "Weapons?" Vorak demanded. The officer's claws trembled over the controls. "Offline. All primary cannons, torpedo systems, even auxiliary batteries. None of them are responding." Vorak's mandibles twitched as he watched another warship flicker and then go dark, as if it had been turned off at a whim. The human warship was not attacking them. It was breaking them. The voice returned, quieter now. "Violence is crude, messy, wasteful. But control?" A pause. "Control is elegant." Vorak forced himself to ignore the creeping sensation of helplessness curling in his chest. "What do you want?" he demanded. The silence stretched for a long moment before the human voice answered. "Perspective." The viewport flickered again. The image of the warship zoomed in, not on its weapons, not on its engines, but on something deeper. A portion of its hull became translucent, revealing the interior, and what Vorak saw made his mind recoil. Inside the warship there was no bridge, no crew, no visible controls or corridors. There was nothing. No pilot, no command deck, no organic presence of any kind. The warship was empty. Or rather, there had never been a pilot to begin with. The realization came like a knife through Vorak's gut. "You aren't human," he whispered. The voice remained quiet for a long time. Then, for the first time, it sounded amused again. "I never said I was." The transmission cut, the warship disappeared. The Dominion fleet was left crippled, drifting in silence. Vorak Thal had always believed in power, in force, in conquest. But now, as he stared at the empty void where the human warship had been, he realized a horrifying truth. He had never even been in control of this battle. Vorak Thal's claws pressed into the metal railing of the command bridge, his breath slow and measured, but his mind roared with chaos. The human warship had vanished again, but this time it had left something behind. Doubt. It had shown him an impossible truth, had stripped away every assumption he had about warfare, about control, about humanity itself. The moment he had seen the inside of that warship, the emptiness where a crew should have been, he had understood. This was not a battle. It had never been a battle. The Zelor fleet floated in stunned silence. Warships, once the pride of the Dominion, hung in space like carcasses drained of life. Some still had power, but none had weapons. Some still had shields, but none had direction. It was not destruction that had befallen them. It was irrelevance. The warship had taken their power without taking their lives. Vorak's mandibles twitched in frustration. He had to think. He had to adapt. Whatever this was, it had rules. Everything did. Even the most terrifying predator had patterns, instincts, weaknesses. If he could find them, he could still win. His second-in-command, a seasoned strategist named Threx Gall, turned toward him, his expression composed, but his yellow eyes betraying unease. "Supreme Admiral, the fleet is—" "I know," Vorak interrupted. He did not need a report he had already seen. He did not need to be told that his fleet was crippled, that his soldiers were afraid, that the very fabric of their understanding of warfare had been shattered. He needed solutions. His claws tapped against the console. "We still have command functions. Communications are intact. Shields can be restored manually." His voice was cold, analytical. He would not allow panic to settle in. "We are not beaten. We are merely learning." Threx hesitated. Learning what? Vorak turned his eyes back to the viewport, to the vast, empty void where the warship had been. What it wants, the warship could have annihilated them. It had chosen not to. Instead, it had spoken. It had demonstrated. It had taught. And that meant it had an objective beyond destruction. That meant there was still a path forward. "Re-establish tactical control of all functioning vessels," Vorak ordered. "I want every remaining ship to run independent power cycles. Isolate systems from external interference and prepare for emergency jump protocols. We will not be stranded here." Threx hesitated again. "And what of the warship?" Vorak's mandibles clicked. "It will return." As if in response, a new alarm flared across the bridge. Vorak did not need to ask what it was. He already knew. The human warship had returned. It did not arrive in a blaze of energy. It did not emerge from hyperspace. It simply existed again. One moment, the void had been empty. The next, it was there, positioned precisely in the center of the Dominion fleet, as if it had never left. But something was different this time. The warship was closer. Before, it had kept its distance, observing, maneuvering, without fear, but never looming. Now it was near enough that the Dominance's external cameras could capture the fine details of its hull. And for the first time, Vorak saw movement. Its surface was shifting again, but now the changes were more deliberate. Not random flickers, not chaotic rearrangements. The hull reacted to their presence, its structure subtly adjusting, as though it were watching them in return. Then the voice returned, cutting through the silence. You're beginning to understand. Vorak did not react outwardly, but inside his mind coiled around those words. You could have destroyed us, he said evenly, yet you did not. A pause. Then the voice responded as if considering something. Destruction is easy. Vorak's eyes narrowed. Then why are we still here? The voice did not answer immediately. The warship moved, slowly, deliberately. It did not need to move. It had proven that it could appear wherever it pleased. But it was choosing to move, a statement, not an action. Then the voice spoke again, and for the first time, it did not sound human at all. Because I am watching. A cold pressure settled into Vorak's chest, something deeper than fear. He had faced extinction before. He had faced enemies who had sworn to burn his people to the ground. But this was different. This was something else, a thing that was watching. Vorak exhaled slowly. You said, this is a lesson, yes. His claws tapped against the metal railing. He would not be intimidated. He was Zelor. The Dominion did not cower before the unknown. Then what is it you are trying to teach? The warship stopped moving. The shifting of its hull ceased. It was as though something vast and incomprehensible had just focused all of its attention on him. Then the voice spoke, and this time, it was not a voice at all. It was inside his mind. Look, Vorak's vision blurred, and then he saw. Not through the viewport, not through any screen. He saw through something else, something vast, something ancient. The Dominion fleet, his pride, his power, his legacy, was small, tiny, insignificant. Beyond them, beyond the battlefield, beyond the known edges of the galaxy, there was something else. Something looking back, a network of intelligence, a presence that spanned across the stars, that had existed before the Dominion had ever been born. It had seen wars, it had seen empires rise and fall, and it had never interfered. It had watched, until now. Vorak gasped, his vision snapping back to the bridge of the Dominance. His claws dug into the railing as he steadied himself. His officers were staring at him, unaware of what had just happened. But the voice knew. It whispered, just for him, "You are nothing but a moment." Vorak inhaled sharply. His chest rose and fell with deep, controlled breaths. He had commanded fleets. He had shaped the course of history. He had conquered worlds. And yet, in that moment, he had never felt smaller. The warship vanished again, but this time, Vorak knew, it had never left. Vorak Thal remained motionless on the bridge of the Dominance, his breathing slow but measured. His claws, usually steady, gripped the railing with enough force to leave indentations in the reinforced alloy. He had always believed himself to be prepared for any battle, for any opponent, for any scenario, but this was beyond war, beyond conquest, beyond anything he had ever known. The human warship had disappeared again, but he could still feel its presence. It was not gone. It had never truly been here to begin with. His officers remained frozen at their stations, afraid to speak, afraid to move. Even Threx Gale, a strategist with decades of experience in war, remained silent, his gaze locked on the viewport as though expecting the warship to reappear at any moment. But Vorak knew it would not. Not yet. The lesson was not over. His mind reeled from what he had seen, from what had been forced into his thoughts. He had glimpsed something beyond himself, beyond the Dominion, beyond this war. It was not the terrifying size of it that shook him. It was the realization of how small he was in comparison. A warship without a crew, a presence that watched but did not act, a force that could cripple fleets without firing a shot, could erase weapons from existence without destruction, could show him an image of something so incomprehensible that his mind struggled to hold on to the memory. He exhaled slowly, releasing the tension in his shoulders. His next words would determine the future of the Dominion, of everything he had fought for. "We are leaving." His voice was calm, controlled, Absolute. The officers hesitated. Some opened their mouths as if to protest, but no words came. No one could justify staying. The war was already over. Only the destruction had been spared. Rex took a step forward. His expression remained composed, but his mandibles twitched, betraying his unease. "Supreme Admiral," he said carefully, "is that wise?" Vorak turned toward him, his gaze steady. "Do you believe we can win this fight?" Threx did not answer immediately. He was an experienced strategist, a warrior who had devoted his life to expanding the Dominion's reach. And yet, even he could see the truth. There was no fight to win. "No, Supreme Admiral," he admitted at last. "Then we leave." He turned to his navigation officer. "Initiate full retreat. Send word to all remaining vessels. We are abandoning this sector." The officer worked quickly, no longer questioning orders. The fleet, what remained of it, began its slow reformation, shifting into defensive positions as jump drives calibrated for retreat. Vorak could see it in their movements. This was not an organized withdrawal. This was fleeing. But it was the only logical choice. His communications officer suddenly stiffened. "Supreme Admiral," he said, his voice unsteady, "we are receiving one last transmission." Vorak's claws flexed against the railing. He did not need to ask who it was. "Play it," the voice returned, smooth and unhurried. "You are learning?" Vorak remained silent. He would not give it the satisfaction of a response. There was a pause. Then, for the first time, the voice asked something. "What will you do now?" It was not a taunt, not a challenge. It was a genuine question. Vorak inhaled, his mind working faster than it ever had before. What would he do? Would he warn the Dominion? Would he advise retreat, caution, diplomacy? Would he tell them what he had seen, what he had experienced? Would they even believe him? His instincts screamed for control, for action, for vengeance. But vengeance was meaningless against something that had never fought him in the first place. His jaw tightened. "We will survive." A long silence followed. Then the voice gave a simple response. "Good." The transmission ended. The warship did not reappear. It did not need to. The retreat was swift. The Zalor fleet did not linger, did not wait for the unseen force to return. One by one, warships jumped to safety, their departure marked only by the faint aftershocks of their engines tearing through space. The dominance remained until the very end, Vorak refusing to leave until he was certain his fleet had escaped intact. As the final calculations locked in, as the ship's engines surged with power, he allowed himself one last look at the empty void. There was nothing there, no wreckage, no signs of a battle, no indication that anything had ever happened. But he knew the truth. As his warship leapt into hyperspace, leaving behind the battlefield that had never been a battlefield at all, Vorak understood what had truly taken place. This had never been about war. It had never been about conquest. This had been a warning, and he would heed it.